Welcome. I'm Jay Shear with Jay Shear Business Consulting. We build solid foundations for service-based businesses to grow and scale and achieve the results and success they deserve. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Does your company have a culture of candor and trust? What does it take for leaders to nurture candor and transparency? What's the impact of candor and trust both inside and outside the organization? Well, on this episode, we're going to explore the topic of radical candor, why it's important, and more. Our guest is a husband and father to four, a retired naval officer and former P-3 pilot, and has served in a number of managerial and leadership positions for over 20 years. He's founder and CEO of the Collective Performance Initiative and a candor coach for Radical Candor, an executive education company based on Kim Scott's best-selling book, Radical Candor: How to Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. He also serves on the board of advisors for 3 nonprofits. Please welcome Aaron Demick. Aaron, thanks for being here, and thank you so much for your service to the country.
Humbled by the privilege to serve, Jay. Absolutely. And thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed researching you, reading your content, and just trying to get as close as I can to your world. So it's truly been fascinating, and I'm so appreciative and grateful that you're here. So let's dig right in. You clearly have a lot going on in your life. I mean, I just scratched the surface by touching on some of the things that you're involved in the intro. But on top of everything else, you're also working on your PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, interestingly enough, you're working on your PhD at VCU, which is where I went to college.
Fantastic. Yes.
So my hometown is Richmond, Virginia.
Right on. Yes,
Yes.
Absolutely. At the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. Yes, absolutely.
Outstanding. Now, I will tell you, when I went to college, that building actually wasn't there yet. So that whole campus has absolutely transformed. It's exploded.
Which was just a couple of years ago, right? Like, they've made a lot of progress since you graduated.
Yes, that's exactly
That's
right.
awesome. Yeah.
So going back a bit, when did you first begin to recognize your interest in human behavior and candor, culture, all of those interesting topics?
Yeah, great question. And I formally, so I'll give you 2 answers to that question very briefly. The first goes just way back to family interaction, friend interaction, but I will say first, like, my first memory of thinking about how is it that we get along with each other, no kidding, was when I was in Little League Baseball, when I started playing baseball when I was 7 years old, and just fascinated by the team dynamic. I'm an introverted person, love people watching, and I can remember my coach and how he interacted with us, all the different players, the kiddos that could have cared less that they were on a baseball team and, kicking dirt out in left center field, all the way to the folks that were just really engaged. And I didn't talk much, still don't talk much, even in meetings. I love listening and synthesizing. And then when moved to speak, I'll speak. So I'll say that's one answer. More formally was not quite halfway through my naval career, I had an opportunity to continue my education at the Naval War College and took on an independent research project for a term that was looking specifically at this candor proposition, because I had lived a little bit of life in naval aviation and a couple of different staff tours before going to that educational opportunity. And I proposed for the independent study project, I'd like to learn more, do a deeper dive reflectively for what I had been through, being on horrible teams, being on the most unbelievable teams, things and a couple in between, and what made that difference. And so for me, I honed in on the concept of candor as a differentiator for the lack of it correlated with lower performing teams, the abundance of it correlated with optimal performing teams. So two answers, that one origination point and then one more formal.
Makes a lot of sense, and I'd love to dig a little bit more into the research that you did and what you found out
Yeah.
during the naval project that you were involved in. But why don't we also, if you could, define for us what radical candor is and also what it's not?
Yeah, definitely. So the easiest way to get into the framework is to think of creating a 2 by 2 matrix with an x-axis and a y-axis crossed right in the middle. And that y-axis, go ahead and label that care personally. And the x-axis, label that challenge directly. And so there are different ways that we can actualize caring personally, but baseline level interaction, maybe during a conversation, just listening to someone is an actualizing of care, caring for them personally. So that's the care personally side. And then challenging directly is just a willingness to bring up your perspective and share it. That may have the potential to trigger someone in an emotional way because you're going to bring it up to them. And that emotion, so what those two axes do of radical candor, caring personally and challenging directly, now set up kind of 4 quadrants of interaction. And when we do care personally and challenge directly, we're exercising radical candor. And so that it is universally human, but culturally relative, in the sense that caring personally looks different for you and I, perhaps in the United States, and maybe even from state to state or city to city, what that actually looks like. But we all appreciate being cared for personally. And the same thing, challenging directly across the world. You have folks that challenge each other a bit directly, where a bit differently when they challenge each other directly. Some folks are very soft when they speak and they use a tone that catches the attention of the other person and they don't have to raise their voice. Whereas in other cultures, they do have to raise their voice and get over whatever is in the brain of those folks' learned behavior, that it gets their attention appropriately. So a couple of different examples, but still the concept remains robust because there are different ways to care personally for each other and different ways to challenge directly.
So, can you give an example of where you've seen differences in different cultures? So, in different parts of the world. So, perhaps here in the US, the way that we look at radical candor versus somewhere else in the world.
Yeah, for sure. So the let's take a very brief example for um, here in the United States. So when I'll go around, if it's okay, I'll give a little more fidelity to the framework. So I'll walk around those different quadrants and then
Please.
I'll offer up some observations. So when we care personally for each other and challenge each other directly, again, that's the space of radical candor. When we don't care personally in the moment for the individual, but we are full on challenging them directly, that's the area of obnoxious aggression, where we can come across as being a little bit more stern, and that typically, yes, it gets the challenge out, but it can be put offish. And if I'm on the receiving end, maybe I'm not as likely to receive what you're saying because I think you're a jerk right now. When we don't care personally and we don't challenge directly, we're in the space of manipulative insincerity. And the reason it's manipulative, it's because it's not that we're not talking about it, perhaps, but we're talking about it with other people and not the person that necessarily needs to hear it. So that's where some of the backstabbing lies and some of the politicking exists, because it's not that we're not talking about it, but it's just that we're not talking about it to the individual that needs to hear it. Or we're even keeping it internal and then using that from conversation or meeting, we're using it to undermine the other person. That's the manipulation piece. And then, so this is where I'll draw it into kind of some cultural nuances. We see a lot of difference in what we refer to as ruinous empathy, which is the caring personally, but not challenging directly. So this is not telling grandma that the last batch of cookies was horrible. It's one of those things that, hey, she makes it great all the time. This was one bad batch. I don't want to embarrass her, don't want to upset her. So I'm just not going to say anything. I'll just say, thanks, grandma. Appreciated the cookies, right? So that's what I have seen here in the United States that migrates into things like Wisconsin nice or Michigan nice, where you have cultures, subcultures, even within the United States, in organizations then where folks, they just won't say anything because they care for the person. They think they're a really good person, and they stay in the block of ruinous empathy. Well, I don't want to embarrass them. I don't want to harm them. And the irony is, and the reason it's ruinous empathy is because they need to hear it. And we need to get over that mental hurdle to try to help them, because when we're keeping it to ourselves and making the judgment that, oh, I'm going to embarrass them and I don't want to hurt their feelings, like that's on us. That actually relieves us from the responsibility of telling them, where the helpful thing is, even at the risk of them being upset temporarily at me, now at least they know and they're aware. So here in the United States, there are many folks that will identify themselves most often as ruinously empathetic for those very reasons. Whereas let's say there are, I don't want to brand any specific culture, but there are areas of like challenge or appear to be short, in Central America, where you have conversations with folks and they're just very short, brief, trite. And in some places that can be received as obnoxiously aggressive, because they're just, hey, boom, this is it. And they're very blunt or brutally honest, if you will. That's the area of obnoxious aggression. And if I'm used to ruinous empathy, if we're not in the space of radical candor, but I'm in a culture where folks, they're trying to protect me, they think they're protecting me, so that's the ruinous empathy. And then I go to a culture that now smacks me in the face with exactly what I need to do, that can be a little put offish and appeared as aggressive. So that's some of the cultural difference. And then one nuance, or actually finer point that anchors this framework, is it's built on a relational foundation. For one, and the better the relationship that we have with other folks, and there are always exceptions to these, because we find ourselves in each of those quadrants, even in healthy relationships. But more often than not, it's likely that when the relationship is positive, we play in the space of radical candor. And I can tell you, Jay, exactly what I saw, offer up my perspective. And because of our relationship, you're willing to take my input. You're willing to see my perspective just as a perspective. And then, hey, yeah, I'll consider it. Thanks, Aaron. Those types of exchanges. But it's fundamentally not measured when I'm the transmitter. It's not what I think and where I think I'm in the framework. It's 100% measured at the listener's ear. It's totally dependent on who is receiving it. So that's what also lends some texture to the cultural difference piece. So in a culture that just appreciates uber directness, if I'm watching it, I may think, wow, that seems obnoxiously aggressive. But for the person in that culture, they see it as radical candor and they're willing to receive it. So 100% measured and assessed at the listener's ear for what they then want to do with that perspective afterward.
That is so interesting. And, as you were going through the quadrants, I was imagining in my own mind going back through my career up to this point, and I could definitely see myself in various phases falling into most of those quadrants. I'm not,
Yeah.
It would be difficult to find a manipulative situation, although I'm sure somewhere down the line something like that occurred. But
Yeah.
it really is so interesting. And to hear you say that it really is reliant on the receiver of the information versus the person who's actually providing the feedback or the commentary. And I can definitely see where that's the case. It truly is fascinating. So how how does an organization then that has employees and customers, but let's focus on employees for a moment, from all different cultures from all over the world. And let's say it's a company that's headquartered in the US, and yet they have employees all over the world. How do
Yeah.
they address those cultural differences when it comes to radical candor?
Yeah, terrific question. And if you don't mind, I'd love to make two qualifying points just based on what you spoke on, specifically as it pertains to you. To clarify for the listeners, the fact that what you just hit on is seminal as well. We all find ourselves in all four of those quadrants, depending on the individual and depending on the environment that we're in. So that's the reality of it. The other is to be mindful of the fact that when we think an individual team member has the tendency to be in one of those particular quadrants, don't keep them there permanently, right? Like that's the invitation. Don't brand or categorize folks, because all of us have obviously the potential to maneuver depending on the feedback that we're given and the
Mm,
willingness of folks to give it to us, and the willingness of us to receive it. So great acknowledgments on your part. We're all in each of the quadrants depending, and don't fix people or brand people in any of those, because we have the potential to move. So
okay.
then, specific to your question, what it really comes down to is the optimal performing teams are the human beings that are capable and willing to see their other team members as fellow human beings, quite frankly. So the amount of listening and learning we do with and for each other to get to know the individual's background and experiences. And another way to actualize caring personally is to remember and know where they're from and what their preferences are. And then now this is where the human complexity, thanks to the human condition, the fact that it does, depending on the folks that are on our team, knowing each individual at such a level and having the cognitive capacity, quite frankly, to keep up with that. So if I have 20 people on my team, literally, if it's a global team like you're talking about, and there are plenty of organizations that have global presence and team members working around the world, how is it if my team member, literally, I'm the only person sitting in I don't know, Chicago, Illinois, and my team is distributed 50% in the United States and then 50% around the rest of the world. I need to figure out what it is that those team members really do care about and how they speak, how they communicate, how they relate with each other. So creating those relationships foundationally, and then understanding what is Jay going to be likely to receive. How is it that Audrey is going to prefer to receive feedback in my perspective? And then
Mm,
tailoring those approaches to care for each other individually, and respect that individuality so that we collaborate better together. So the teams that are able to do this, no kidding, they do know the members of their team very well. And then the positional leader is able to speak in a way that increases the likelihood that they're going to be received across all those individuals. When it's a homogenous team, it's a little less demanding because that norm is established and you're able to do it. But creating a common language around radical candor, the framework itself gives us the platform then to tailor for the individual. So happy to clarify a little bit more if it wasn't clear there, but that's really how it's accomplished. Does the positional leader have the cognitive capacity to speak to each member of their team in a way that they feel cared for personally and they're willing to receive the challenge directly?
hmm. Wow, that is super interesting. So, in your experience, and you've been around this for a number of years,
Yeah.
what would you say? What are the key things that are holding companies back from, from actually implementing radical candor within the organization? And so that would be one piece of the question that I have for you. And then the other side of that is, what would be the catalyst itself that would create change and transformation in those organizations?
Yeah, great questions. So, and I'll try to confine my answers to fewer words, and then if you have any additional questions, we'll go for it. The biggest element that I've seen with organizations, and certainly events over the past year, notwithstanding, but perceived and very real pressures on the organization to deliver, how it is that they communicate with each other, what are the current behaviors within the systems, policies, procedures that the organization currently has, like essentially the culture that they have. And one of the biggest hurdles we've seen is essentially the rut or the behaviors that are already established, and making it very difficult. So if an organization is Michigan nice and they're in that ruinous empathy quadrant, to convince them that they can go ahead and start challenging each other a bit more directly, that doesn't happen overnight. So that because they're in that rut of, well, I'm just not going to say it. They'll figure it out, or we'll have a conversation some other time. So we first have to get over that mental hurdle of sustained behavior of what's the accepted norm in the culture. So then more directly to answer your question, what's the catalyst to do that? What we've seen is the organizations that reach out, they're really passionate about, one, the change. Like they know something needs to change because the path they're going down, interaction-wise, collaboration-wise, relationship-wise, culture-wise, it's not working. So they have feedback there. People are leaving the organization. They aren't generating as much revenue. They don't have as many creative ideas. Pick your flavor. The idea is they'll come to the Radical Candor team to ask, how can we form this common language? So the catalyst now is actually having the opportunity to do a deep dive into the concept and framework of radical candor and then practice it. And that's really where, and there's plenty of research that continues to come out, like what is the learn, do, learn, or do, learn, do, where chicken, egg, wherever you want to start, where does that actually start happening? Hopefully for the proactive organizations, they've said, hey, nothing major has happened right now, but we need to have this conversation because we need to talk with each other a little bit better. And we know that this framework can help us. Some folks come to us because there has been some significant event in the organization, what are some specifics in this?
Yeah, without getting into details.
Yeah, without getting into details.
Give me something that our audience can wrap their head around.
Yeah, so something like, well, let's take a couple. Well, we can take a couple public examples, but things like the 737 MAX with Boeing. And what continues to come out with that, it was communication failure and training failure because their team members didn't necessarily trust each other, and there was some communication barriers internal to the systems and processes that they had there. So then it results in that, in what we had, the grounding, and unfortunately, people getting hurt and passing away because of it, all the way to maybe it's a D&I issue, where someone had a significant occurrence in the organization and someone was wronged unfairly, and it rose to the attention for the executives, hey, okay, we need to do a deeper dive into this and see why this is happening. So let's talk about it honestly. Obviously, we weren't doing it up until this point, so let's figure out how to talk about this differently. So just a couple of examples of organizations that can be proactive. Hey, things are going well. Let's get this in place and build on what we already have with this radical candor framework. And then others are reactionary, so that they're forming that common language. They have the opportunity to practice it across really the spectrum of feedback, soliciting it first, giving it, which is both on the offering praise end of the spectrum and offering criticism end of the spectrum, and then gauging it while we're giving it so that we understand the reactions of the individuals that are receiving it and how we can adjust our language and stay in the conversation, and then encouraging it, right? This is what good looks like. We have examples. We have team members that do this incredibly well. Let's try to figure out what it is they're doing so well so that we can replicate it and now start to turn the tide of the cultural challenge issue problem we may have internally.
Wow, super interesting. There's so much that I'm thinking about as you're talking about this that I really want to try to unpack.
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to share the the components of candor. So you've spoken about this before, and you've spoken about three very specific components. So could you touch on those and how they all tie together?
Well, and three very specific components. What are you speaking to
So
specifically?
yeah, so you've spoken about character, competence,
Yes,
and courage
yes, yes,
as
yes.
three very specific components of candor. So I don't want to steal the fire, but I'd love it if you could speak to each of those, because sometimes some of this might come across as being obvious, but it's not quite so obvious, especially as we look around at the small business community and business in general, where conversations aren't happening the way that they could or that they should be happening. And that creates opportunity for improvement. So I'd really love it if you dig into all three of those for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the clarification, because yes,
Yeah.
we've made we've combined. There's a convergence with the radical candor framework that Kim Scott has given the world, and then also how I've moved forward in my dissertation research, and that's so I'm happy to sit here for a second. So we'll start with character. The character piece is that and Kim talks about it as well, but John Stuart Mill, we're corrigible beings as humans, which means we can change, and the willingness to do that. When we are the individual that sees someone doing something, so they're behaving in a certain way that has a negative or unproductive impact, it's our moral obligation to actually let them know. So that's where the character proposition really originates from. In our character, are we willing to have the hard conversation? Are we willing to let folks know, hey, they did really well? Because there are challenges there, right? Like even the mental struggle, as minimum or maximum as it could be, if you and I are on the same team and you're the rock star 3-point shooter on the basketball team and I'm the person underneath getting rebounds, but you're just lighting it up and getting all the attention, depending on my identity, my ego, I may refrain from saying, well done, Jay, because I'm jealous or whatever that is. So there's a struggle there. Well, I have to park that and just say, well done. We won as a team and you were lights out shooting 3-pointers today. The opposite could be true if I see you, there's some behavior that you're demonstrating that is counter to the esprit de corps of the team. You're yelling at one of our other teammates. I now have a moral obligation, just like a moral obligation to say, hey, well done. I'll put my own identity ego aside for a sec and say, well done. If you're doing something that's counterproductive, I have a moral obligation now to say, hey, do you realize when you barked at Dwayne that way, did you see his reaction, man? Like, we lost him. So that hurts us now going into the second half. I don't think he's in the mental space right now. So just to bring it to your awareness. So two different ways on both the positive and productive or developmental ends, praise and criticism, that I'm actually feeling a moral obligation. It's in my character to go ahead and offer that up. So a couple of examples there. The competence piece can be all over the map, but really where I love honing in here, and it's a blends and an element of character, and then the competence piece is there's a humility component to this, and then there's also a helpful component to this. And that's where the competence piece comes in, because the helpful is actually acknowledging the fact that I want to offer you my perspective in a humble way, acknowledging that it's just my perspective. It's how I'm seeing it. A tie into Emily's book, right? The how is it we're perceiving it. The way I'm looking at it may or may not be 100% truth. So I'm just going to offer it up to be helpful. That's the competence piece. Is I acknowledge I don't know the 100% truth, but I'm competent enough and willing enough to be helpful and offer that perspective up. So it's competence based on a knowledge from observation that I'm just willing to share with you. And then the last piece, that courage component, and you see these are all interrelated, but that courage component is actually the willingness to make good on that moral obligation. Do I have the chutzpah to actually let you know? Or am I going to keep myself at bay? And when I keep myself at bay, I'm in the manipulative insincerity block. And
Okay.
that's where, and some folks, myself included, certainly initially struggle with this, because I don't think I'm a manipulator. I don't think I'm insincere. But if I'm thinking something, and this doesn't mean every thought 100% all the time, but it is the manipulative component is I'm having a thought about a perspective, something I saw, and my decision is actually to not engage. It's to not see that by doing this, I can help. I think I can be helpful for the other person. So I have the courage to actually go ahead and do that. And then exercising that, the other side, the vulnerability of acknowledging it's just my perspective. It may not be true, so I'm willing to change. But then it's also, hey, once I put myself out there, I could tick this person off. I could make them cry. And acknowledging the fact that, all right, I need to do this in the best interests of the individual, our relationship, and whatever team, group, family we're with at the time. So plenty of words there.
I tell you, it's fascinating. It truly is. And it all ties right back to an area that you've been studying for quite some time on the human behavior side.
Yeah.
And so many things that we think about when we are confronted with a situation where, we're questioning ourselves whether we should have the conversation with someone. And, we go through the pros and cons so very quickly, and delivering the message the right way seems to be such a critical component of all of this. And I think back at one point in my corporate career, the way tough conversations were handled sometimes, and I'm not sure of the right term to use, but the tough information was delivered in the form of a sandwich, right?
Yeah.
And so you had great news that was delivered first, or something positive was stated, and
Yeah.
then you would put what you really wanted to communicate, what the behavior was that needed to change, in the middle, and then on top you would leave the conversation with another positive message.
That's right.
And so whatever we call that, the issue that I had with that method of communicating is that the person on the receiving end typically only heard the last piece of information that was shared, which was going to be the positive piece,
Yeah.
which is fine, but they miss the intent of the area of improvement and the true point of having the candid discussion.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's something that you've seen throughout your experience, but it's something that I saw time and time again. And it again amplifies and highlights the importance of messaging.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you hit right on, even as an instructor in naval aviation, on the receiving end, when I would be the student going up or upgrading, trying to get qualified, that's what I was on the receiving end of. And then when I became an instructor in a couple of different squadrons and roles, it was taught the same way. And you're exactly right. It's ineffective for the reason that you stated. Folks they'll downplay the middle because you just left on a positive note, which has other benefits. But you're right. The research clearly shows that that is not the most effective way to offer feedback. And so we ended up actually modifying at one of the schoolhouses, one of the fleet replacement squadrons, the manner in which we did debriefs because of that. But for a long time, even naval aviation did it that way. More recently, we use, and Radical Candor is consistent with this as well, for offering praise and offering criticism. So it's anything on this feedback developmental spectrum, situation, behavior, impact, and then next. So when you can go in, and so I'll describe that briefly in just a second. But
Okay.
the other beauty of Radical Candor, like my guess is when you had the positive thing to improve and then positive, folks took time to be able to get ready for that and deliver that to you. And then you had a conversation most of the time, is my guess. Radical Candor conversations, like offering praise and criticism, these should be like a couple minute max impromptu talks. So the idea is to practice it and get so good at it that we see each other in the hallway. Hey, great meeting. Jay, this last Monday morning meeting, it was phenomenal. You gave clear guidance. You didn't say at all. And when we left the meeting, we actually felt invigorated to go out and do what we're being asked to do. Can we see that again? I would love for you to lead the next meeting. That's situation, behavior, impact, and next. The situation, capturing the context, that Monday morning meeting. What were the behaviors? You used very clear language. You didn't say and you gave us what we needed. Then the impact was we left ready to go. The next is, can you lead the next meeting? And we can do that across, and it's the Center for Creative Leadership has used that for a little over 20 years now, if memory serves. But it's very rarely practiced. Like from team to team, it's just not, folks think they got it. And then the pitfalls here are the fact that folks, instead of the situation and the behavior, they'll forget the situation, so they don't mentally place the individual when they saw the behavior. So, I might be wondering, what the heck are you talking about? Hey, the last meeting. Well, I've had 10 meetings since we last saw each other. Which last meeting are you talking? That kind of thing. So it leads to confusion. So it's vague, unclear what my behavior was. And a significant tripwire for many of us is, instead of stating the behavior, we put our judgment on that behavior. And we never explicitly state the behavior. So rather than, so I might say, hey, Jay, the last time we talked with each other, I saw you talking to Audrey, and it was very rude. Like, that's a judgment. I just put a judgment word on what your behavior was. Instead of saying you used foul language, your tone was way high, your nonverbals were visceral, and however else you want to qualify it, but those are the elements of your behavior. Speaking in that tone is the behavior, rather than calling it rude. So that's where we get tripped up.
Yeah, because that's the only way that, if you're providing me that feedback, I need the specifics in order to improve, so I have some sort of benchmark to work from.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. And then offering up the impact, that is my assessment of what was the aftermath of your behavior in that setting, in that context. And the reason without it, if I'm on the receiving end and you don't tell me the impact, I can very easily discount it, because you did not make the connection for me what my behavior resulted in. But when I offer my perspective of what the impact was, well, we saw Audrey, she got very emotional, and I couldn't approach her the rest of the day. Like, it threw her day completely off. And that it's not a judgment. Like, that's what we both could observe about the behavior, so that you're able to now connect the impact to the behavior that you had in that setting. And then the next is, and it goes back to the intention to be helpful and just offering up the perspective. The next proposition is, well, what do we need to do about this? Do you need some help? Is there some time management? You feel stressed? Whatever that is, you let me know. And then now together we can figure out how to address it.
Aaron, we see these situations come up so often in not only business settings, right, but in settings in life in general. But, as we're focusing on business, just being able to have more self-awareness around the types of communications that we have. And when, if we see a situation that needs to be addressed, understanding the right way to approach it, but ensuring that you're providing the details, right, the specifics, and encouraging the person as well, but giving them that path forward, but doing it at the right time, doing it in a timely fashion. It's incredible, because it seems like it would be common sense, but it's not common practice.
Totally. Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are three things that kind of factor in here, if you don't mind sitting here for just a minute or two.
Sure.
Yeah, fantastic. So Sheila Heen and Doug Stone at the Harvard Negotiation Project published Thanks for the Feedback a few years ago. And it kind of gets to exactly what you're talking about from the challenge side of things, specifically in the different environments, because this obviously falls into a category of easy to say, hard to do. And we don't live it as often, because you're like, yeah, situation, behavior, impact, next, simple enough. And then we screw it up all the time, because something falls out of order, or we didn't include one of the components as we're talking. And then that has the potential to just derail conversations. And once we've lost the conversation, one, it's very difficult to get back into it. Two, it can lead to obviously reverberations later on down the line of unwanted or unneeded conflict and a bunch of challenging elements to any given team. They talk specifically on going back to the receiving end. The thanks for the feedback is focused on how is it that we're receiving feedback? And they see three challenges in particular that are impediments for our ability, all human beings, our ability to be on the receiving end of feedback, regardless of how it's delivered. So they talk about the challenge of the C, the challenge of the we, and the challenge of the me. The challenge of the C is, so again, Jay, I hope you don't mind me using you as an example. If we're having a conversation and you're offering up your perspective to me, you're offering up some criticism to me. Mm-hmm. On the receiving end, that my challenge of the C is, do I see what you are saying to me as credible? Is there some element of truth to it? Or do I think you're full of hot air and your perspective is way off? If it's the latter, I'm less likely to receive. If it's the former, I'm more likely to receive it because I see what you're offering as credible and helpful. The challenge of the we is, what's our relationship? If it hasn't been the healthiest, I'm less likely to receive what it is you're saying. If it's a great relationship, or at least, hey, we're on talking terms and we're functional with each other, I'm going to be more receptive to what it is you're saying. And the final is the challenge of the me, which is, do I hear what you are saying as an attack on me personally and my identity? Or are you trying to address the behavior I demonstrated that needs to be corrected? So if I see it as a strike against my ego and identity, less likely to hear you. If I see it as you being helpful and trying to address a deficiency, an area where I can improve, I'm more likely to be receptive. So when folks start to really couch their brains, the mindset across these three, and even create the framework in your own head, see, we, me, is it, and go across those categories. And the idea is being mindful of it, even on the receiving end. If I can get myself to the place of seeing what you're saying as credible and truthful, our relationship is fine. And it's not an attack on me personally, but trying to be helpful, we're in. And that's the environment we're trying to create. So I get you, I hear you. In organizations, teams, groups, as small as 2, there can be some significant challenges, but I'm trying to be concise with the elements, the essentially tools in our toolkit that we can draw on. And the more we draw on them and practice them, the better we get at both transmitting, offering it up, and receiving it. Because it takes both, right? It takes both. And too many folks focus on one or the other.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that. The challenge of the me piece of that, that would be a really interesting one to have to manage through, if you actually, for both on the receiving side as well as the giving side. But on the giving side, if you've handled if the first 2 components of that seem to be congruent, but then but then the me part of it, they're not getting it, right? Whether it's ego or any other number of things that could get in the way. Is that something that is manageable, coachable?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. And one of the very practical ways to do that, and now we'll tie back to kind of the framework as we're offering up the Radical Candor framework, that is in the order of operations, getting it, giving it, gauging it. That's now your question, is gauging it, is the inroad to trying to help with what you're talking about. So nonverbals are a huge component of our communication. Not just the words we use and the tone in which they're delivered, but those nonverbals. When we offer up criticism, one of the telltale signs of someone that may be struggling with the challenge of the me, the identity, and attack on their identity or ego, they're going to be triggered emotionally when we offer it. And so when we see that as a reaction, so very practically, if I offer up something to you and I see you get red-faced or shut down, one way that I can attempt to help both of us stay out of the challenge of the me is to say, Jay, what I just said, it looks like it landed a little wonky. What's coming up for you? and then sit there in silence, because I've tapped into some place in your brain that resulted in that reaction, that nonverbal. So if I'm in tune to that, one, it's caring personally for you because I know that about you. We've had enough interactions, whatever, or just a human to human, I see that initial reaction. Now I give you an invitation, what's coming up for you, and then I give you time and space by shutting up. And I just sit there. And then you can ruminate through, and when you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen. And if we need to, we can even reemphasize, hey, Jay, I'm trying to be helpful here. I'm sorry I put you off in this way. Let me know what's going on. So this isn't fiction, it's fact. It's how we as human beings behave. But regrettably, more often the reaction is when you get upset, now I get upset, and now we're in a completely unproductive conversation because it was the challenge of the me. You saw it as an attack. I was attacking your identity, and now it's become completely unproductive. And then that takes healing and time and recovery to even get back into the conversation. So we're trying to avoid that, and just in the moment as best we can when we're gauging it, how can I gauge that emotion and then give you an invitation to sit there, give you the time and space. And when you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen. That's the part that doesn't happen often enough.
Yes. So, oh my gosh, such powerful advice. And I know that, this is going to resonate with quite a few of our audience members, because again, it is something that we run into unfortunately, on more of a regular basis than not. And
Absolutely.
we have to really look at the impact of this when we allow this to continue within our organizations without addressing it and without having the difficult conversations and creating that space that you're talking about to allow the conversations to take place, to accept it, and ensure that the message is being delivered as effectively as possible. So let's talk, because you briefly mentioned this somewhat toward the beginning, but when we build a culture of candor and we're having tough conversations, we're having good, meaningful conversations, we're open with one another, what are the outcomes? What do we see? What are the benefits?
Great question. And research continues to show better listening leads to better leadership and perceived leadership, increased engagement, decreases in levels of stress, increases in collaboration, and the overall elevation of performance in general. And again, it's how is it we are creating and nurturing an environment within which we can humbly and helpfully offer our perspective to each other so that there's reciprocity right there. And when you take all the tools that we've talked about during this conversation and put them together, put them into practice, even calling out the fact that, yes, hey, this is something newer. We're trying to form this common language. I'm just practicing it. Jay, would you be willing to listen? I would like to run something by you, practice it with you before I deliver it. Like start inculcating those types of behaviors that really are just, there's a direct correlation to higher performance, higher revenue generation, decreases in conflict and confrontation, litigation, folks that, there are all kinds of benefits. And again, the research shows this, that better leadership in general, when folks feel listened to, when they feel encouraged to offer up feedback, and then what good looks like in the organization is replicated. This framework is replicated where we care personally for each other, challenge each other directly, such that we really start to nudge toward, as Kim puts it, we love not only what we do, but who we do it with. I mean, again, for the people that think that this is some pie in the sky fiction fantasy type of tale, I'm here to tell you, I've interacted with teams that they've reached this. This doesn't mean folks get ticked off. This doesn't mean that it's all nice. For fluffy kittens and unicorns, like it's just not. It's fact. And the most optimal performing teams in the world actually exhibit these human interactions and human behaviors. They've proven successful. So yeah, plenty of benefits here for creating a culture of radical candor.
Yeah, I think that is phenomenal, and it's so important to focus on the benefit side of it because it's a process,
Yes.
just like anything else. And if you don't currently practice that in your organization, you may listen to a conversation like this without necessarily paying attention to the benefits and think to yourself, "That's uncomfortable." Right?
Totally.
How am I going to, as a leader in a business, how am I going to have these kinds of conversations? And I don't even know how to get started. I mean,
Yeah.
I can see those kinds of conversations coming up, but you've hit on some very, very important points and why it's so beneficial and why we should begin to practice this. Have you read Principles by Ray Dalio?
Yes.
I I tell you, I love that book and I refer back to it on a regular basis. Matter of fact, I have it sitting right next to me. But Ray does a great job talking about radical transparency and candor within his organization and the type of organization that he built. And I got to tell you, when I first read it, when I read certain sections of it, it was very uncomfortable because I'm imagining what it
Yeah.
must be like. And you've experienced this as someone who coaches other organizations, but going through that process, if it's not something that you have been practicing before,
Yes.
that has got to be it's got to be quite a process.
Yeah, for sure. And there is, and Kim talks about this. She offers it up um, in the second version, the second edition of Radical Candor to qualify. There are some differences with what Ray offers up with radical transparency that are a little bit different. And I see your hint of a smile and shaking your head. Because the radical candor proposition with care personally challenged directly is a compassionate proposition. Like no kidding, it is very much moral obligation, care personally for each other because we can develop. So we're going to talk about it. I will say, certainly for Ray and his team, like I've never met him. I don't know. I've never been a part of that culture or interacted with any of them, but it is a very unique culture. So like you said, and they've had some challenges with turnover and
Hmm.
finding that appropriate cultural fit because of the manner in which they've designed, they've encouraged and created that culture that they have. Huge benefits to it, but it looks and works for them. The radical candor framework is a bit more universal just because of that caring proposition and approach. And it even goes, so that's a wonderful example of the universality of the radical candor framework and how it's molded to be effective for Ray and his team, his organization. Hopefully that makes sense because even interorganizationally here in the United States, like that culture looks very different than another firm in his industry, if you will. But the radical candor framework remains consistent because it's how they care for each other personally and how they choose to challenge each other directly.
That makes perfect sense, and thank you for drawing that comparison there, and all showing both the comparison as well as the differences, because it's too easy to, if that's the only reference point that you have,
Yes.
that can be an extreme
Yeah,
approach
that's
again,
exactly
but it works in
what it
that
works.
particular environment. But others may look at that and say, I couldn't do that in my organization, and here's why. But you can, but there's always a different way. There's different approaches that you can take.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. Absolutely. And it's,
Soup.
yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So I want to talk about for just a moment, since I brought up that particular book and you've talked about radical candor, the book Radical Candor. What are, other than those, what are 1 to 2 books that have dramatically affected your outlook on life?
Oh, phenomenal question. One without hesitation is Adam Grant's Give and Take. So I had an opportunity when I was at the Pentagon to befriend Adam about six years ago. Does that sound right? 6 or 7 years ago. I can't remember, but and interestingly enough, so yes, the give and take proposition, not to get too long-winded, but definitely there, a different approach to whatever might be termed for you as success. Not fully giving, not fully taking, but how are you otherish? How do you give more than you take? But for self-preservation, even, we need to take a little bit, but avoid the extremes. And Adam does a phenomenal job talking about that. When I met him and let him know that I was in the Candor space and doing the research, he said, I know someone I need to introduce you to, and it was Kim Scott. So he made that initial connection, and he said, I have a friend that has been in the Candor space. She's getting ready to write a book, all that stuff. So that was that initial connection. And then that's an excellent question. What's another one? And is it just in general for me personally, or kind of in this space?
For you personally.
Okay. So for me personally, James McGregor Burns on leadership. And the reason I say that, it's a very, very involved seminal work on what are the ways and means of leadership in public service, in the public service arena, and the proposition that it's a never-ending, evolving. I'm trying to think of the best word, but public service and the interaction with the public is never done. So even when nations, elements are elevated for all of the citizens, so some really good things going on, and folks feel like their needs are being met, there's always going to be the next need. So as we make progress as nations and citizens, we're always looking for the next thing to progress on. And we're obviously seeing that even present day. And he does a phenomenal job. It is a very involved academic read, but it's a seminal work on all of the elements of leadership in the public service space.
Interesting. I'll have to look into that one. I'm not familiar with it, so I'll check that out. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So I've got to tell you, I mean, really, my goodness, there are so many different areas that I would love to continue to dig deep on with you. So we're going to have to reschedule or schedule a part 2 to this, because because I believe that not only is what you're sharing so incredibly helpful, there are many out there who are going to listen to this, and I just know they're going to be hungry for more. I just know it as much as I am. So we'll work on that piece of it. But I did want to ask you, so before I get to my final question to you, there's two things I wanted to find out. Number one, what overall message would you like to leave our audience with?
Phenomenal question. Your willingness to be curious about what some of the elements that we've talked about today, and try them, practice them with your teams, share with them what you're doing and trying to do. There's no doubt in my mind, as scratchy or difficult, Jay, as you alluded to, that this may be for some of us, the benefits are incredible, and it advances every team.
Outstanding. And the other piece is, where can we go to connect with you and learn more about the content that you put out and more about the types of services that you provide?
Yeah, fantastic. So certainly feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, and the Radical Candor website. So if you Google my name, the LinkedIn will pop up, and also can Google Radical Candor, LLC, and you'll find more information there.
Excellent. And we will make sure that we link to those in the show notes.
Yeah, fantastic.
So here is my final question to you.
Yes, sir.
What are you adding or eliminating from your life to live a more fulfilled and purposeful life?
Tremendous question. Regrettably, it took a pandemic to show me time with family has been incredible. And so the last several months, I've traveled obviously a ton pre-COVID. I've traveled during COVID with certain clients, observed the protocols and safety, and even coming back home, quarantining in our basement, so as not to put the family in jeopardy. But I will share with you, through a 20+ year military career, and now having the opportunity to engage with just remarkable human beings that are trying to get at this, what we're talking about, the radical candor, the learning and leadership development, character development, a ton of travel. But what the last several months has shown me, as my travel has been way more sporadic, is I've missed out on a lot. And I knew that I would, while being in the military and being deployed and being away. But it's really shown me the opportunity I now have to spend more time at home and continue to build those quality relationships with family and friends that I really, for all kinds of good and positive reasons to be away. I'm realizing now, at least for agent stage for me right now, time with family, huge meaning. So yes, I'm in the process of figuring out how can I dedicate a little bit more time and not fully move back to the life I had pre-COVID, because there are tremendous benefits for what we've been able to explore during this time period as a family. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but terrific question. Time with family.
Okay. It's a beautiful response, and Aaron, it's amazing the ripple effects that creates and how that impacts so many other areas of our life, our professional lives. So I'm right there with you, So thank you so very much for joining us today. I'm truly grateful for you being here. Thank you for being candid. Thank you for sharing of your knowledge, sharing your wisdom with all of us, providing such great practical and actionable advice and content for us. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to round 2.
Absolute pleasure, Jake. Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to rejoin you as well.
Fantastic. And for all of you, my friends, thank you very much for watching and listening. And please take a moment to subscribe and let Aaron and I know what you thought of this episode. I would love to hear what your takeaways are. And to enjoy more episodes and to learn how J. Shear Business Consulting can help build a solid foundation for your service-based business, go ahead and visit jshearbusinessconsulting.com. And until next time, keep learning and growing. Be more candid in your conversations, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care.